Traveling by ferry is a common experience of Seattleites and others living around Puget Sound. Washington State Ferries operates 10 routes serving 20 ports around the Sound. Most familiar to Seattle residents are the Bainbridge and the Bremerton ferries, leaving from Colman Dock at Pier 52. But Colman Dock was not the first ferry dock in Seattle, and for a long time it wasn't the only one either. When the Denny party first arrived in what would become Seattle in 1851, they had only the area's natural beaches to land their boats on. The tides at Alki were too strong to build piers, influencing the Dennys and several others to move their settlement across Elliott Bay to the more protected tide flats. This location was then called Djililech, or Little Crossing Over Place, and was home to a large Duwamish renter village. In 1865, the newly incorporated city of Seattle wrote laws preventing Native Americans from camping on city land, effectively displacing the Duwamish to other settlements. The move across Elliott Bay was soon followed by the arrival of Henry Yesler in 1852, who built a steam sawmill at the end of the Skid Road, where cut trees were skidded down to the water, and with the sawmill came Seattle's first dock. When steamboats came to Seattle, they were obliged to call at Yesler Dock for lack of anywhere else to land. In 1852, the only steamboat on the Puget Sound was the sidewheel steamer Beaver, but in the coming decades many more would appear. As Seattle developed, Yesler's Wharf was joined by a coal dock and twisting railroads on pilings, but passenger boats continued to call at Yesler. Foggy conditions in Elliott Bay sometimes hampered steamers looking for the wharf. In 1864, Captain Libby of the J.B. Libby spent an hour circling Elliott Bay looking for the pier. Eventually, the steamer's whistles alerted the townspeople, and the bells at the University of Washington were rung to help bring the J.B. Libby in. The Yesler Wharf burned several times, but was finally totally destroyed by the Great Seattle Fire of 1889, which also leveled most of the city. It was replaced by the Alaska Steamship Company's Piers 1 and 2. Leaving Pier 2 were the boats of the Port Orchard route, such as Athlon, Tourist, Telegraph, and Inland Flyer. In 1882, the Colman Dock was built just north of Yesler Wharf. It was originally intended for the Oregon Improvement Company's coal bunkers, but it burned like the rest of the city in 1889. After Colman Dock was rebuilt, it became the primary terminus for Mosquito Fleet ferries plying the Puget Sound. Colman Dock fell under the control of the Puget Sound Navigation Company, which was later known as the Blackball Line, and in 1910 a rate war between Puget Sound Navigation and the Kitsap County Transportation Company caused the KCTC to be banned from landing at Colman Dock. KCTC moved several docks north to the Galbraith-Bacon Pier. In 1888, the city of Seattle received its first double-ended ferry, where wheeled vehicles, mostly horse-drawn carts, could be loaded directly onto the main deck. Appropriately, this new vessel was named City of Seattle, and it ran from the foot of Marion Street over to West Seattle. The fare was 5 cents, and was an attempt by the West Seattle Land and Improvement Company to sell lots in West Seattle. In the summer of 1889, the city of Seattle was offering 10 round trips a day. In 1907, the ferry was replaced by the more modern West Seattle, which offered separate decks for vehicles and passengers. The city of Seattle was sent to California, where it still exists as a houseboat in Sausalito. The rise of streetcar lines running to West Seattle eventually put the West Seattle Ferry out of business in 1920. Between the dock for the West Seattle Ferry and the Seattle Fire Department Station 5 sat the Flyer Dock. This pier was for the use of the steamship Flyer, owned by the Columbia River and Puget Sound Navigation Company. Flyer ran from Seattle to Tacoma, a trip taking her just 90 minutes, from 1891 until 1911, when she was purchased by the Puget Sound Navigation Company and moved up to Everett. The Flyer Dock was then purchased by Grand Trunk Pacific, a Canadian railroad company, which built an enormous pier in 1910 to handle the traffic of their fleet of steamships. The pier burned in a spectacular blaze in 1914 and was rebuilt. The area where the West Seattle Ferry Dock and the Grand Trunk Pacific Dock once stood is now part of Colman Dock's staging area for cars on the Bainbridge and the Bremerton routes. Moving north, the next pier is the Seattle Fire Department Station 5, which is still in use today. The next dock to the north was Pier 3, which was originally a shed for the Northern Pacific Railway. The first tenants were James Galbraith and Cecil Bacon. It was later known as the Galbraith-Bacon Dock, or just the Mosquito Fleet Dock, where Kitsap County Transportation Company waged their fight against the Puget Sound Navigation Company. It is difficult to imagine the sheer level of activity at Pier 3 around 5 o'clock each weekday evening. Lined up along the south side of the pier would be the KCTC steamers, each with a white band on their stack and a red letter K. These boats were all scheduled to leave at the same time, about 5:15, to accommodate commuters and shoppers heading home. In the chaos of blowing whistles and ringing bells, the boats began to back out of their slips. The Reliance was headed for Harbour, Colby, and Manchester, while the Vashon II went on her way to Rolling Bay. The Bremerton and the Hyak started out for Rolling Bay along different routes. The Burton made her way to Bainbridge Island, followed by the Monticello for Port Blakely, the Bainbridge for Eagle Harbour, and the F.G. Reeve for Silverdale. Pier number 3 was also later home to the unique air ferry of Gorst Air Transport. With a fleet of float planes, they offered service to Bremerton with a transit time of just 12 minutes. The service operated from 1929 until the mid-1930s. South of the old Yesler Wharf and later Northern Pacific's Piers 1 and 2 sat the Pacific Coast Company's Piers A, B, and C. Pier A was known as the Ocean Dock and was where large coastal steamers landed, while Pier C was known as the City Dock and was where one could catch intercity Mosquito Fleet steamers to locations such as the San Juan Islands and Port Angeles. At the height of the Mosquito Fleet era, around 1910, a passenger headed for the Seattle waterfront had their choice of 200 destinations. Of course, first they had to get to the ferry docks, which was an adventure all on its own. Standing between downtown and the piers was Railroad Avenue, which consisted of 6 lines of railroad tracks full of cars and shunting engines headed for various piers along the waterfront. Before pedestrian overpasses were built, a person on foot had to dodge the strings of railroad cars to reach the waiting rooms of the various Mosquito Fleet docks. Once there, pedestrians had to compete with horse-drawn carts transporting all manners of freight intended for ports across Puget Sound before finally reaching their intended boat and boarding. The Kitsap County Transportation Company went out of business in 1938, the same year that a young Ivor Haglund leased part of the pier for an aquarium and fish and chips stand. Today, the pier is known as Pier 54 and is home to Ivor's Acres of Clams. During World War II, the U.S. Navy took over much of the Seattle waterfront and decided to rename all of the piers. Before this, the waterfront was a confusing mix of numbered piers, lettered piers, and some docks only known by their names, such as Colman Dock. Instead of this, the military renumbered the entire waterfront from south to north. This is how Colman Dock became Pier 52, and the Galbraith Bacon Dock, old Pier 3, became Pier 54. Next time you're on the Seattle waterfront, running to catch one of the big Washington State ferries, or maybe the King County Water Taxi or the Kitsap Transit Foot Ferries, spare a thought for a time when there were multiple ferry piers to choose from and a fleet of dozens of steamers headed to hundreds of ports across the Puget Sound.